Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to see a full house for this conversation about moral injury in journalism. Thank you very much for coming and for joining us. I'm going to introduce the Rory Peck Trust, explain why we're looking increasingly at mental health concerns and how today's conversation is relevant to our resilience programme. The Rory Peck Trust is a London-based non-profit organisation dedicated to the support, safety and welfare of freelance journalists around the world. We believe it's imperative to support journalists because they are on the front lines of protecting our democratic freedoms. I'm going to show a brief 50-second video to give you a feel for our work for those of you that aren't familiar with us. All the visuals you saw in that video were shot by freelance news journalists nominated for our annual award ceremony. We have a crisis fund and a recovery fund which provide assistance grants to freelance journalists struggling with financial hardship. Over the last 2 years, we've seen an increasing amount of requests asking for financial support to cover the cost of therapy to help journalists manage their mental health. And to respond to this growing need for psychological support, we launched a resilience program funded by Meta, which enables journalists to access trauma and resilience workshops delivered by the DART Centre Europe. The program also includes a therapy fund, which launched in January. In addition to that program, we have a dedicated trauma fund for Afghan journalists funded by the KBF Foundation in partnership with Anthony Feinstein on my left, whose academic work covered the trauma experienced by journalists in Afghanistan. It was actually in my conversations with Anthony that he shared with me his hypothesis that moral injury is going to be the next big challenge for investigative journalism and will be much more prevalent than PTSD. So I was surprised because I'm quite close to the challenges that freelance journalists face, and that this concept of moral injury was unfamiliar to me. So that's why we're here today, to raise awareness of this issue and to find ways to support journalists through it. I'm going to introduce Anthony first, who will present his work on moral injury, which focuses on developing a usable framework for newsrooms to assess who might be struggling with this. And we also have 2 wonderful journalists with us here today, Sana Terlingen on my left and Amira Al-Sharif on my right, who have generously agreed to share their own experiences with us. So Anthony is Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Toronto and Director of the Neuropsychiatry Programme at Sunnybrook Health Science Centre. He has undertaken numerous studies looking at how journalists are affected psychologically by their work in zones of war, conflict and disaster. He is the author of Journalists Under Fire, The Psychological Hazards of Covering War, which I know was used as a reference by managers at the BBC. He's also advised many other newsrooms, including CNN and Agence France-Presse. He co-authored a study into the emotional impact on journalists covering the refugee crisis with Hannah Storm, who now heads up Headlines. They first introduced the concept of moral injury in this very room at this festival 4 years ago. Anthony, over to you.
So thank you very much, and I'm very happy to be here. I'd like to share some data with you. My first slide, please. So this is a study that Clotilde made reference to. I did some research with Hannah Storm 4 years back looking at how journalists were covering the refugee crisis. And we showed that journalists were not that troubled by post-traumatic stress disorder or depression, but the question of moral injury came up in this work. And so what exactly is moral injury? There are a number of different definitions, but this is one that I think captures it. So this is the injury done to a person's conscience or moral compass when that person perpetrates, witnesses, or fails to prevent acts that transgress their own moral and ethical values or codes of conduct. So just look at that for a moment. So these are things that people do, or you might do, or things that you fail to do in response to events that are morally troubling. When we did our research with the refugee crisis, we had a problem that within the field of journalism, there isn't a method to capture moral injury. The military do this very well. We know that soldiers who came back from the war in Vietnam had a real sense of moral betrayal. Soldiers coming back from the war in Iraq in 2003 had moral injury. You know, they went off to war thinking that they were going to create a democratic country, and in the end, you ended up with a failed state and Iraq in terrible trouble. And soldiers who came back from that conflict had a sense of moral betrayal, that their political leaders or their military leaders had betrayed them, and they have a real problem with moral injury. But with journalists, this discussion has not been had. And when we did our research, we had to borrow from a military model to try and capture moral injury within your profession. And of course, journalism and the military are two very different fields. And so what my research group now is trying to do is to develop a scale for moral injury particular to journalists. So this is a work in progress. So far, we've enrolled 159 journalists. We want a target sample of about 300. The first thing was to have roundtable discussions in different Canadian cities. We brought journalists together and said, this is what moral injury is. Tell us what you think in your work is morally troublesome. What's morally injurious to you? And we analyzed the data with a number of statistical approaches, which I'm not going to go into here. We came up with a list of what we term morally injurious events. This is what journalists told us they found troublesome. And I'm not going to read through it over here, but you can see that they were troubled by things that editors did. They were worried about what news organizations did from a moral perspective. They were concerned about their own behavior from a moral perspective. They saw things in some of their colleagues that troubled them morally. There was a whole issue of what's going on online and people's behavior online and the morally troubling behavior of harassment and bullying and targeting. So these were morally troubling questions, and there were many, many questions that they felt we should look at. We ran a statistical analysis and we boiled it down to 15 questions, which I have up on the screen over here. Now, remember, this is a work in progress. This is going to change. One of the consequences of potentially morally injurious events is that people start changing their behavior. And you can see the way their behavior starts changing. They become disillusioned by things. They become socially distant from people. They start to doubt themselves. They feel changes in empathy towards colleagues, towards subjects. They become cynical about what they do. And so there's a whole potential range of moral consequences that can come from morally injurious experiences. And this can reflect the way they practice journalism. It can reflect the way they relate to colleagues, to friends, to family. And this can have a profound effect on their life. Now, I'm happy to share these slides with you so you can get a sense of what some of these consequences are. But some important points. This is a work in progress. We're still working on it. This is going to change once we complete our full sample. But the consequences of moral injury are becoming clear, that it can affect the way you work professionally, it can affect your relationships, it can affect your quality of life. What's important about moral injury is that it's associated with a number of primary emotions of guilt, of shame, and anger. It's also important to realize that moral injury is not a mental illness, and I think it's very important, unlike post-traumatic stress disorder, which is. And you often find PTSD occurring together with moral injury. So I can give you an example that you may witness an event that's morally shocking, a suicide bombing that blows up innocent people. That's a very traumatic event that can lead to a person developing PTSD. But because the event itself is morally wrong, targeting innocent civilians, killing innocent civilians, that can also become a sense of moral injury. And you can see how the concept of post-traumatic stress disorder can, to a degree, overlap with moral injury. But they're two very different things. You come back to what is moral injury? It's witnessing or perpetrating or failing to prevent behavior that transgresses your own moral code. Post-traumatic stress disorder is something very different. PTSD is you are exposed to a life-threatening event, a very significant trauma that can affect you in very particular ways. You develop a whole set of particular symptoms, flashbacks, nightmares, intrusive, unwanted recollections of the trauma, avoidant behavior, difficulty concentrating, falling asleep, more irritability, feeling under threat. That's a very clearly defined psychiatric condition that's quite discrete from moral injury, even though there can be overlap between the consequences and the events that cause it. The other thing is that moral injury can also become the conduit to depression. And so when you're constantly confronted with morally troubling events, that can weigh you down. There can be a sense of despondency and despair that comes with it that can lead to depression. Depression, of course, is a mental illness, but moral injury is not, and I really want to emphasize that. People have said to me, well, do we all have moral injury? That we live in a morally troubled society, there's so many worrying things going on from day to day, maybe we all have moral injury. And the answer is no. People will have their moral compass set at different levels. Everything in my profession lies along a continuum. You can have mild happiness to profound happiness, mild sadness to overwhelming sadness. You can have some moral distress that's mild to moral injury that can be quite profound that starts changing your behavior. And so people will be exposed to morally injurious events all the time. Think of politics in the United States with Donald Trump. Yes, this can be these are morally troubling things, and some people recognize it as being morally troublesome, but they don't worry about it. They just get on with their lives. Whereas for other people, this becomes a very, very important event. You tend to dwell on it, you think about it, it starts affecting you, your moods, etc. That's when moral injury starts becoming a particular problem. So when these morally injurious events and consequences start intruding into your life and affecting your behavior, start affecting the way you work or your relationships, that's when moral injury becomes this big psychological struggle. It's also something that can be dealt with. So, if you have a sense of moral injury and it's troubling you, you don't have to suffer from it. There's some effective therapies and approaches that I can discuss later. So this is a work in progress. We've not finished with it. We will continue doing this work, but I'm delighted to have this opportunity to come here and discuss it with you and to share my thoughts with you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Anthony. That was a really, really eye-opening and easy to understand presentation from a neuroscientist. I now want to introduce you to Sanne Terlingen on my left. She is an award-winning investigative radio journalist working for Argos, the main investigative radio program in the Netherlands, a public service broadcaster. She specialized in stories of migration, trafficking, and sexual abuse. For the past 3 years, she has worked with over 100 survivors of organized child abuse to verify their stories. She's also one of the founders of Lost in Europe, a cross-border journalism project that tries to find out what happened to thousands of child refugees who disappeared after arrival in Europe. Sanne is a 2019 Ockberg Fellow at the Dart Center for Journalists and Trauma at Columbia University. So, Sanne, I was introduced to you because the Rory Peck Trust Resilience Program actually funds trauma management workshops delivered by the Dart Center. And you have been an Ockberg Fellow of the Dart Center because you regularly work on stories with people that have children and other people that have experienced deeply traumatic events. And so you have been in this world for a long time, and you're very psychologically aware. You've done this fellowship. You know how to prepare for reporting traumatic stories. But I think in this last year, you were recommended to me because of your colleagues at the Dart Centre that, no, you've struggled despite all this preparation and support with moral injury. Would you care to share your experience with us here today?
Yes, where to start? Yes, I was quite well. It all started for me with a single story, the story of Lisa. Lisa was a 15-year-old girl when she went to the police to state that she had been abused by her father and several other men, that they raped her in a forest close to her house. And she also told the police that she delivered a baby that was killed. And Lisa was not believed. The police told her that they couldn't find any evidence, that the way she talked about the delivery was probably a recovered memory, or her mother influenced her because she just divorced the father, and the girl was sent away. And we were confronted with a trauma therapist who said that Lisa had severe PTSD, but we also found a lot of images of child abuse on the computers that were used by the father, and we got medical evidence that Lisa had been pregnant. So that was the story that I started with. And when we broadcasted it as a radio documentary, actually nothing happened. The case was not reopened, and it was just that. And then other therapists and other people came to me and they told me, I have a similar story. Or in our trauma centers in the Netherlands, we have about 40 clients who tell the same kind of stories and are not believed as well. They don't even go to the police anymore. And when these kind of messages came to me, I realized if I want to do this, I have to be very well prepared. So that's also when I signed up for the Ockberg Fellowship at the Dart Center. And I thought, I can do this. I'm with a public broadcaster. I was allowed to do it with a colleague, so we did all the interviews together. We had a lot of walks. Also to process what we heard. I got training how to view traumatic imagery. I got a lot of lessons on how to set my boundaries, how I could treat my sources well. So all these kind of things we really prepared. And it was still quite heavy, of course, because one of the things I didn't realize is that you really get, if you want to work with people who are traumatized in their childhood, you really have to build a bond of trust. So I got close to them, and some of them were still being abused or still sharing stories that they were being raped by a network, and they showed me the evidence. So I started to see that in my own country, people that I got close to experienced these things and they were not helped. So that was the first time that the investigation started touching me and what I believed in, because I grew up with the idea that the Netherlands is one of the safest countries in the world, and if I publish something as a journalist, things change, and the police always does the right thing. So this was the first time that my view on my own country changed. And I'm also the mother of a daughter, so I started to feel, okay, is this a safe environment to grow up with? Should I work harder to change my own country? So I started to work more and more, also as a coping mechanism for the powerlessness you feel when you work on this subject. And when we made one big radio program called Shards of Glass and Dark Rituals, where we presented the stories of the group of women and men that we worked with. And one of the main findings was that there was overlap in the stories they told. So the women and girls that were not being believed, they talked to me about the same locations of abuse and the same perpetrators. And they also had we didn't have hard evidence, such as videos of the abuse, but we did have medical evidence, for example, that they had been in hospital for pregnancies, or that for one girl, or several girls actually, that they had been in hospital with glass in their vaginas, and that they received threat letters, phone calls from outside. So we thought this is enough to broadcast a story that we have a real problem with women reporting organized abuse and not being believed. But what actually happened afterwards is that we got a lot of backfiring. We got, everyone here knows, I think, QAnon and the conspiracy theorists, and they started to pick it up online and use it to say that our complete government is, that there are pedophiles in our government, and they used our radio documentary as evidence for that claim, and also right-wing parties started to pick up our publications and use it. And we also had a lot of backlash from some scientists and others who are reporting on recovered memories. So they said that the stories of these women and girls were all made up in therapy, and that I was a believer, and that I was not a good journalist. So we also got these scientists saying that to newspapers, sending it to our office. And we also still had these girls reporting to me that things were still happening to them, and that they were even, the girls who said that they were still in a network, they also came up with phone calls that the threats to them worsened because the network was putting pressure on them because of our investigation. And what actually happened was that this also created a lot of pressure on our office and on our colleagues. So what I really needed was a safe environment during this investigation, but even our own office became a place of discussion, and we were all under pressure. And it even ended with the conclusion that we had to stop the investigation, that the editor said you could no longer investigate this topic because it's not working out for the office. So that's where I started to feel morally injured, because I felt like I'm investigating this terrible thing. Nothing's changed yet, but I have to stop investigating. But I do see that terrible things are happening. So that's where my moral injury comes from.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Sana. How could the newsroom and your colleagues and the leadership have, what would you have needed from them, do you think, to protect you from this struggle with moral injury?
It's quite difficult, because I think you can never fully protect someone, because they cannot do anything about the right-wing parties or about the hate speech that we get online. But what is needed is that you know that they're behind you, whatever happens, and that if you have your doubts, whether it's doubts about the sources or whether you have doubts about should I continue or not, that you can talk freely about it, and they help you to find a solution to do your investigation as good as possible. And what I do see, especially in European countries somehow, that we have this belief that to be an objective journalist, you cannot be emotionally involved. So when you go to an editor and say, this is touching me, or it hurts what I'm seeing, they say, we might have to take you off this investigation because you're too involved, instead of what do you need to continue your investigation. And actually, I didn't want to be taken off in any investigation. I wanted to continue, but I wanted to find out how to do it safely and how to do it in an ethical way. So there's this fear of emotions in journalists.
I think that's fair. Did you want to make a comment, Anthony?
Well, thank you for that. I think just one of the themes that came up repeatedly when we asked journalists to help us understand what's morally troubling is that this is exactly what you said, that they felt they weren't getting the kind of support from editors or from news organizations that they wanted. They felt that on certain stories, the news organizations or editors would arrive at decisions that were morally compromised, and that becomes an added source of distress. So you're not just dealing with the distressing nature of the story that you're covering, but there's also now the added stress of not feeling supported or backed up by your editors or your news organizations. So it becomes a cumulative problem.
I've also heard from other researchers at the Dart Centre that they are looking a lot at journalism education and the culture of journalism, and some of their research is not completed yet, probably will be by next festival, so we might be back here to talk with them. But there has been a lot of conversation about how the culture of journalism is always to consider the other and the person you're reporting on, and to consider your audience. So you're taught to be aware of what your contributors are feeling and what the audience is feeling, or what you want them to feel. There's very little self-reflection or training about how what you bring to the story or might affect you, or how the story might affect you as the journalist. And to recognize that we are all human beings, and we're creatures that feeling creatures that think rather than thinking creatures that feel, and we have to recognize this if we want to be the best journalists that we can be, and if we want our public service broadcasters to uncover the inequalities in the world or injustices, we have to find ways to support those on the front lines of all these injustices, the investigative journalists like Sana, like Amira, who are literally on the front line of not only the distressing stories themselves, but often repeated trolling online, which has its own psychological effect as well as the story. So that's one of the conversations we're trying to have here. I'm going to turn to Amira and introduce her, and then once she's shared her story with us, we can then have a discussion, and I will check my Twitter feed to see if any of you have sent me any questions you would like me to ask the panel. So, Amira Al-Sharif is an award-winning Paris-based Yemeni photographer and artist with 2 decades of visual storytelling experience. Over the years, she has received numerous awards and fellowships, including the World Press Photo Foundation, the Magnum Foundation, the Prince Claus Fund, and the Arab Fund for Arts and Culture, as well as the Samir Foundation. She's also been nominated as the Free Press Unlimited Most Resilient Journalist Award, and her work has been published by National Geographic, The Washington Post, The Guardian, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and the New York Times. She's also been commissioned by UNICEF and UNHCR, among others, and written a chapter for the best-selling anthology Are Women on the Ground? Essays by Arab Women Reporting from the Arab World. Her photography has been exhibited all around the world, from India to South Korea and Cambodia to the United States. In 2010, she studied photojournalism and documentary photography at the International Center for Photography in New York, then returned to Sana'a in Yemen to teach visual storytelling to aspiring photographers. But in 2018, she had to flee Yemen due to the war constraints on her work and her life. Amira has since completed a 2-year-long artistry residency at the Cité Internationale des Arts and is currently pursuing a Master of Fine Arts at the Beaux-Arts de Paris. Amira, thank you very much for sitting with me here today and sharing your story with us. I know that you have created a little project of your own to introduce your work for us, so we will screen that video now for you.
Thank you for having me, Claudine, and I'm happy to be with you. I prepared a little video. In fact, it's a union for my journalism and arts practice. I dreamed I was working in an office in my home city of Sana'a. When I heard the news that a war had just been declared on Yemen, I kept asking my coworkers again and again, what will happen to us now? After I woke up from that nightmare in my home in Paris, confusion suffocated me. Why in 2022 am I dreaming of the declaration of a war that has already been devastating my country for the last 7 years? What makes me think that the war is only starting, when in reality it may never end? Each day feels like a declaration of war on my life. The war zone is thousands of miles away from me now, but it's still at the doorsteps and rooftops of my beloved ones. I am no longer facing bombs, but rather memories so intense and frequent that I can't truly say. War lives in the body, following you no matter where you go. Over nearly 2 decades, I photographed beauty and suffering across my beloved Yemen. These hundreds of stories and thousands of images are more than journalism for me. They are my life, my wants, with me every day, no matter where I go. On the topic of moral injury, I find myself searching for answers, just like in my dreams. What happens to me now? If I share my story of moral injury, will the process help me accept a criminal war that I cannot change?
So, Amira, you have been a photographer all your life, and you became a war photographer when the war broke out in Yemen, in your country. And you chose to show, through your photojournalism, the resilience of Yemeni women, in the hope that showing women being women and children being children would highlight our common humanity and make us realize that we could all be victim of an unjust war led by powerful people making immoral decisions, as we continue to see in Yemen and now also in Ukraine. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about how your experience of being a war photographer has impacted you and your work?
In fact, the war is the reason that I'm with you today, and the reason that I was forced to self-exile in Europe, in France. What happened to us Yemenis is really what happened to Ukrainian people. It's the campaign of the world powers terror. And I would say who really violating our human rights, our human values.
You spoke to me about how war affects everybody, but maybe you want to tell us a little bit about how it affected you as a photojournalist.
It affects me because it invaded my dreams, even if I was so busy in my life, in my new life in France, but I was having lots of nightmares, flashbacks, and the real fact, or the big guilt, that when I left Yemen, I left with all my hard drives with me, and luckily, I reached good international media, and I thought I'm gonna success to enlighten the world to stop providing the Saudi with weapons because they are killing the Yemeni civilians. But after a few years, I realized I'm powerless to stop this criminal war. And I truly feel for the Ukrainian because it's not in their hands. It's international powers.
How did you know, or how did you start to feel that those feelings were affecting your work, or how did you recognize that your work was being affected by that experience of moral injury?
As Professor Anthony said, I felt disconnected. I would be in one place, but my mind in another place. Yeah, maybe it was more that I felt I no more exist.
Yeah, and you shared with me the feeling that not only did you not exist, but it felt like all Yemeni civilians didn't exist.
Exactly, because I'm one of the people, like my work doesn't separate me from the fact that I'm also a Yemeni, and I'm not just there photographing, like I'm photographing my own family getting hit. Like the first 3 rockets that fall down on Sana'a, it was on the neighbors of my married elder sisters. So in that moment, in fact, we didn't know even that there were like airstrikes, like my family, they didn't know. 2 in the morning, 3 rockets fall down, and all the place was in orange color. And they went to street without, like normally in Yemen we wear palto, but they just went to street. My brother, he started turning the car, and they moved. And luckily, if they didn't move, I could have lost half of my family at that night. At the first night, the rocket fell down on Sana'a.
So this is something I've heard from other journalists as well, that there's a big difference between covering traumatic events in a place that is foreign to you as a journalist, or covering traumatic events in a place that is your home as a journalist. And I know Sana also felt that when the story became closer to home, when she was actually investigating this child abuse in the Netherlands, it was much harder for you, wasn't it? Because it was too close to home.
Yeah, I've investigated child abuse in Djibouti as well, for example, or a Dutch millionaire abusing Ghanaian girls. And I really fought for these stories. But when I went back home, it was my own secure justice system. And I felt like this is not going to happen close to me. So I could leave the stories there, even though I felt they were really important to tell. So it's not like I felt less for these girls, but I could leave the stories there and felt like I did something to change the situation, and that was what I could do. And the other stories were in my own world, and they were with me all the time.
And I know, Anthony, that you said one facet of moral injury can be when your own leadership or the people in power in your own environment are making decisions that don't fit with your own moral compass.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really interesting about moral injury is that it can come about from acts that other people do, so people perpetrating abuse or people, starting wars and keeping wars going. But it can also come about from acts of omission, things that have failed, things that people don't do. So we have an expectation that individuals are going to do the right thing, that when you bring to light a story of abuse or where there's a war there that's characterized by a lot of injustice, we expect people to step up and try and fix it and to try and make it better. We have expectations of how people are going to act. And when they don't do that, it becomes an act of omission, things that are not done. And that can become morally hurtful as well. We see this all the time. The classic example that's happening in Canada, which is where I live, is that there's a story of the missing and murdered Indigenous woman, and this is a very painful Canadian story, and journalists working on it are profoundly moved by it because there's so much pain within this community, and what journalists are hoping for is some kind of action on the part of authorities to try and take away that pain, and it doesn't happen. And if there's an expectation that somehow reporting on it is going to make it better, and then it doesn't make it better, it becomes very difficult for journalists to process that. And one of the messages that I try and put across to journalists is that you have to be able to manage your expectations. So if you're reporting on a war in Yemen or you're covering the story of abuse, if your expectations are not met, then you feel this act of omission, and that becomes a source of moral injury. And it's often very helpful in situations like this to try and reframe it, which is, okay, I recognize that what I'm doing is not going to profoundly change anything, but what I'm still doing is very important. I'm informing people. I'm creating a historical record. In time, people may be held accountable because of what I'm doing. I'm collecting the facts. And, I'm there as a journalist to tell a good story. I'm giving a voice to people who don't have a voice. And when you frame it this way, when you start seeing your actions in this light, it becomes much more rewarding. It becomes validating. It becomes helpful to you, as opposed to thinking about, well, I'm going to change things, and nothing changes, and you end up with a perpetual sense of disappointment and hurt and shame.
Can I add something to that? I think that a lot of journalists are really vulnerable for this, because you don't go into journalism for the money. You go there because you're really driven internally to fight injustice and to report about it. So this also makes us, I think, extra vulnerable, because we're emotionally involved in what we do.
Yeah, and there's the trap for your profession, which is this. You go into a story that's very painful, you get moved, your humanity is moved by the story, and then you want to do something about it. And you run the risk of stepping outside of your profession and, maybe acting as a social worker or as a first responder, because you want to try and help the people that you see in distress. And that becomes a slippery slope, because you're doing things that you're not trained to do. And I've seen this time and time again. I come back to the story in Canada of the missing and murdered Indigenous woman, in which the journalists, many women journalists, felt so profoundly moved by the story that they felt they had to do something extra. It wasn't just enough to tell the story. How can I help these people on another level? But you're not trained or you're not equipped to do that kind of work. And so you put yourself in a very vulnerable position, because this is what you're trying to do. It's understandable. It's your humanity. You've been moved by it. But you have to be careful of that. And one of the messages that I put across to journalists is that if you're doing your work as a journalist and you're doing it to the best of your ability and you're telling your story as well as you can and you're reaching a wide audience, that in itself is profoundly validating. That's a very powerful thing that you're doing. Be careful of trying to act as a social worker or a medical first responder, because you're taking on a skill set that you're not trained in, and that's potentially problematic.
This is actually one of the things that I learned at the Dark Center as well, that you really have to set these boundaries. But it's also clearer for the sources, because they know what to expect from you and what not to expect. And it makes your journalism better, because people know that you know the boundaries and that you're acting as a journalist. So this really helped me also to make sure that I didn't cross that line of starting to help people.
Amira, did you want to add something?
Yes. In fact, I listen, but I also, at that time, and at this time also, I still believe with the journalism as a fourth authority, but no more. And what I expect, and I truly don't see it as a high expectation, that accountability, solidarity with the Yemeni war, because now we are entering the 8th year and the war is still sustained and full in Yemen.
So we've spoken about the definition of moral injury. We've spoken about two very different experiences of moral injury. We've heard from Anthony about the necessary need to understand the role of journalism and to explain it to the next generation of journalists, but also for current journalists to understand their motivations and what they can do within journalism. I think it's really interesting, Anthony's point about slipping into acting as a social worker, particularly when we realize that all social workers have supervision. All counsellors have supervision. There is inbuilt psychological support in those professions, but there isn't yet inbuilt psychological support for journalism. So that's what we're here to try and sort of start a conversation on and show the evidence of. Anthony, could you tell us how the scale that you're developing could be used as a tool to try and build in that psychological support that we know is needed in journalism?
So once we've developed the scale, I would like to give it back to the profession to use, and newsrooms will be able to use it. It's going to be a very simple self-report instrument that journalists can fill out, in which you will actually be capturing the kinds of morally injurious events and consequences that I spoke about. So it's one way of starting a conversation about it. It's a way of recording what the symptoms of moral injury are. You can use it to monitor people's responses. You can give it a time one and record their responses. You can come back 3 or 4 months later and see how they're doing. Are the symptoms getting better? Are things improving? Are they getting worse? So it's really a very useful way of capturing the whole spectrum of moral injury. Within mental health, we do this all the time. You've got rating scales to record symptoms of depression. Well validated. We use them all the time. Anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder. You can give them to people. It takes a few minutes to fill out. You capture the symptoms. You know what's going on. There's nothing like that for moral injury within journalists. The military have it. The military have moral injury scales for soldiers that are very useful. But you cannot take a military model and apply it to journalism. They're two fundamentally different professions. So what's missing right now in journalism is a scale to capture moral injury. And my hope is that by the time we finish collecting our data, we will have developed it. Then we can hand it over to newsrooms, we can translate it, we can validate it in different languages, and you can start a useful discussion on what I think is a very important point. And it's also a way of monitoring what's going on within your news organization.
So if anyone here today or any of your colleagues might be interested, you may have seen in the introduction, the presentation by Anthony, that he's already interviewed 159 journalists, but he needs a sample of at least 300. And if you want to get in touch with the Rory Peck Trust or with Anthony directly and suggest any further interviewees for his study, that would be really useful. Other than that, I'd like to, it's obviously going to take time, as it always does, to change things or change how we manage people. I think, interestingly, the pandemic has made us all much more aware of emotional and psychological effects on our work, on our workforce and our teams, and how that affects the work and the journalism that is produced. So I feel like it's a good opportunity now for all of us to be increasingly aware of psychological support and needs within our newsrooms. Until we get to that stage, maybe Sana and Amira, you could just share some of what you found has supported you, the ways of coping or of building resilience that you found have been useful in your own journeys.
I think Amira can start. Do you want to start?
One of the things that make me copy the last 2 years, in fact, art, because journalism statistics is enough, but in art, soul, everything. Art.
There is I was very taken by your description that journalism has a very strict moral code and art is much more fluid and has allowed you to express your own feelings. I think a little bit, like I said earlier, in the journalism culture, you're not expected to have feelings. And as Sana said herself, you can be accused of being unprofessional for having feelings in journalism, which seems to contradict the very humanity that motivates journalists to cover these stories.
In fact, I would just add a little bit to Sana, because she already said, but in journalism, when you are in the field, you need to block your feelings entirely until you finish, like you really finish the shooting, wire the work, and then it's last thing you think about how to process your feelings. In art, you get encouraged to unblock your feelings from the beginning, but it's interesting because in journalism, you block, but then unblock. Because like me or Sana, we did the work, and we blocked our feeling for somehow, but later now we are today with you because we are trying to unblock the feelings that we needed to block them in the process to do the work.
Sana, did you have any other tools at your disposal or any other things that helped you rebuild your resilience?
What really helped me during the process was to set the boundaries. One example was that we were confronted with the girls who wanted to get out of the network, and because I was bonding with them, they asked me for help. And when I realized that this was not my responsibility, but I could give it to someone else, so not doing nothing, but organizing an organization where they could go to, I could put this off my shoulders. So what really helped me was to put more boundaries on what was my job and what was not. And it also, what also really helped me is to see the good things in life. Because when you're confronted with these kind of heavy stories, it's easy to get involved and you feel like, no, I'm not allowed to watch Netflix anymore because these people having far worse experience than I do. So if they ask my help, I'm there. I can't say, no, I'm watching TV this evening. And I really found out that I just needed to find time to watch the good things in life, so to connect with other people who are healthy and to just go outside for a walk with people who are normal and who don't have problems. And that also really helped me to realize that it is allowed to make this time, because you also need that time to process of what was happening and not become too cynical.
I think a lot of journalists struggle with that. Your profession, particularly if you're an investigative journalist, means you spend your whole time looking at what's wrong with the world. So that will undoubtedly affect your perspective. Amira, you mentioned that your work, even during the war in Yemen, is often motivated by trying to find the light.
True.
And I think has that, and then you mentioned that art helped you express yourself in a way journalism didn't. So your art and your self-expression obviously helped you cope. Was there anything else that helped you cope?
My family, my sisters.
Yeah.
I have 6 sisters, and they are my biggest source of inspiration. And they just used to always, whenever I finish with an assignment, I just return to the capital. I sit with my sister and I tell them all the stories, and definitely my international friends, always.
I think Anthony, your work will confirm that human connection and the freedom to express oneself is important, isn't it?
You know, I've been doing this work for 20 years, and we've collected a very large data set now of close to 1,000 journalists who are working in conflict situations. And recently we looked at the data set and said, what are the factors that can predict who's going to feel stressed and who's going to feel less stressed? And what's interesting about this data is that it crosses cultures. So it's looking at journalists who've worked at the Balkans, the war in Iraq, Syria, Kenya, Iran, Afghanistan, so multiple cultures, multiple conflicts. And we can distill certain common denominators across this all. And one of the most powerful protective factors is good relationships. That when you've got good relationships to come back to at the end of a day at work, when you've got solid friends, good family connections, a good relationship with your spouse, etc., it's protective to your mental health. So exactly what you said over here, that when you connect in a healthy way outside your work, it makes good sense, isn't it? It's good for your mental health. And this is across all cultures, across languages, across countries. It's a shared humanity. These are things that we want.
Anthony? I have one question that's come through to me from the audience. anyone who's here today or watching online can DM me on Twitter. The question is about how can we get newsrooms and editors to recognize moral injury, which is a subtle definition of a psychological struggle, when mental health concerns in general are often still taboo. Now, you've worked with a lot of newsrooms, Anthony. What has been your experience of mental health issues in newsrooms?
Yes, it's been a struggle. But I think you can convince people with good data. So you have to show people what the data are. So collecting good data can be a game changer. But the other thing is, it's good for news organizations to deal with it. You know, this is going to make your news organization better. If you've got healthy journalists, that benefits everyone. It helps your newsroom. So, you know, by dealing with this, you're actually helping yourself. Avoidance is a really bad coping strategy. We know that. When you avoid something, things don't get better. They tend to get worse. And so there's a compelling argument for saying by doing this work, you're not just helping your journalists, you're actually helping yourself. You're helping your organization. If you've got a newsroom that's traumatized or a newsroom that's struggling with morally injurious topics, it affects multiple people. You know, you're aware that this is not a healthy climate in which to work. And so sensible people get it, you know. Mental health is something that can affect everybody on multiple levels. And by avoiding it, it's not going to get better. So it's in everybody's interest that you deal with it. And I think by putting this message across and you support it with good data, you start changing people's opinions.
Can I say one last thing? It's more about what Amira and I discussed online before this panel, that I'm lucky that I'm in a safe environment, so I can go and work on my emotions. But it's not that easy if you have to start over again because you have fled your country, because you can't work on your emotions if you have to organize where you're going to live, if you have to worry about your friends. So I wanted to ask Amira also to explain what she needed to feel more secure.
Home until now. And it's a need, it's basic, before going to dreams. And it doesn't happen until now, after 4 years.
Thank you so much for coming today. It's really encouraging to see a full room, to continue this conversation that Anthony and Hannah Storm started in this very room 4 years ago. We would love to come back next year and share the results of the data and maybe introduce the scale that Anthony's spoken about, talk to some newsroom editors about how you can use it and how you can support your journalists to keep doing the important work that they do. Thank you.